Thank you, thank you. Just in case for the Omegas who were in the house, it was not a tribute. That is part of the African tradition for you. You know I had to say that. Let me first of all acknowledge a couple of our state leaders who are here. Attorney General Brown was here, as well as Lieutenant Governor Brown was here, as well as Attorney General Gansel. Let's give them a round of applause very quick for their presence here as well. We have a number of state delegates, senators, and here as well. They please stand quickly for us. State delegates and senators throughout the state of Maryland, please stand and acknowledge that they're here as well. Senator Frost, thank you. Council President Craig Rice, the members of your county council, please stand quickly. Thank you. The Superintendent Starr and Board of Education members, please stand. Thank you as well. And Congressman Van Hollen, in his remarks, will acknowledge a couple other people as well. Some years ago, I was attending a program in Baltimore, and the speaker was talking about the great work of a congressman, and he didn't mention the name at first. He talked about how intelligent he was, his understanding of budgetary matters, his variety of issues that he's tackled over the years. And it wasn't until the very end that he actually mentioned the name. But before he actually mentioned the name, I knew who he was talking about. And we all know a person who is intelligent. We see him repeatedly across this nation on the national media, because in many ways he embodies the real strength of leadership, intelligence, hard work. Whether he's talking about the budget, the environment, education, transportation, he's there. Many have said that he is a rising star. I've said repeatedly that he is a star because he understands it. He served Maryland in the House of Delegates, the State Senate, and now he serves as our representative of the U.S. House of Representative for the 8th Congressional District. He gets all of the big things, but that's not why I like him so much. Because the big things are things that obviously are things that really tugs at his heart, and we need his leadership there. But despite all the big things, he's here in our district every day, dealing with the small things that impact the quality of life of people. Whether it's responding to a problem in Litchfield as it relates to buses and transportation, or looking out for a few veterans who need vouchers for housing, or dealing with a common constituent problem each and every day. He gets all of that and more. We are fortunate to have representing us one of the strongest, most intelligent, and most compassionate voices in this country. Sometimes when you have people around you so close, we fail to acknowledge and understand how great they are at times. But when you step back and you look at what he's accomplished in a relatively short period of time, and you step back and understand that he is a person who really understands all the intricacies of government, and he touches the lives of people every day, and we have him right here in our midst. I'm proud to call him a friend. We are deeply proud to call him our congressman for those in the 8th Congressional District. But he's a person who's been here virtually every year. And I've said for a period of time, it is now time for us to bring him forward, because far too often we've taken this strong local voice with a national and international presence for granted. Let's welcome warmly our congressman, a person that represents all of us, whether you're at the national level, the state level, or the local level, or right here in our everyday communities, our own Chris Van Hollen.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you, Ike, and thanks to you and the brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha for the good work you all do in our community, in our state, and in our nation. And many thanks to your chapter president, Joe Allen, the co-chairs of the Breakfast Committee, brothers Bob Hatchell and Adrian Nelson, for asking me to join you all today as we rededicate ourselves to the mission of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I am truly humbled by the invitation to join you and speak with you at this grand annual gathering. I'm not only grateful to the brothers for their good work, but to the chapter's Alpha wives who have been recognized nationally for their good work. After all, it was Coretta Scott King who, the day before her husband's funeral, led the Memphis sanitation workers' march that Dr. King had gone to support before he was shot. And of course, the United States Capitol, we have memorials to Rosa Parks and Sojourner Truth, heroes of the movement. So I salute today all the brothers and sisters of the movement and say thank you for the honor of being here. I'm also pleased to be with many of my colleagues in public service. Our county executive introduced some. I just want to acknowledge John Sarbanes, a colleague of mine in Congress. And I want to praise the good works of Congresswoman Connie Morello, who I know is here and worked very closely with the Alphas. Good to see you, Connie. I also want to say what a privilege it has been to work in partnership with the great Alpha, my friend, our county executive, Ike Leggett. He has led our county extremely well, always providing leadership that combines compassion and inclusion, the hallmarks of Dr. King. And I am confident that he will continue to do so. Thank you, Ike Leggett, for all your good work. I'm also a little envious of Ike's good public ratings. You know, not long ago, I was wrestling with my son over the television remote control. He was trying to grab it to get ESPN. I was trying to get it to see what the breaking news was on CNN. And finally, I got it away from him, got CNN, only to see the breaking news that Congress had now reached an all-time low in public approval of 9%. Below cockroaches, below colonoscopies, below lice. As someone said, we were down to family and friends, and our friends were abandoning us quickly. Anyway, that's the last time I tried to wrestle the remote control away from one of my children. It was so bad that some of the religious leaders started to get in on the action. Just as we open today's breakfast with a prayer, we start each day in Congress with a prayer by a visiting religious leader. And not long ago, a pastor started the prayer before the Congress and then abruptly stopped. And some of us went up to the pastor and said, "Why did you stop? Surely you were praying for the 435 members of Congress." And the pastor shook his head and said, "Well, no, that's just it. I looked out at the 435 members of Congress and decided I better pray for the American people instead." Now, that kind of sums up the public mood today when it comes to Congress. And here's the thing, I don't blame them. I agree. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, I believe in the power of prayer, and I believe in the power of faith. But to change things, it has to be faith in action. It cannot be passive. Nobody understood that better than Dr. King. He would deliver a sermon in church to reveal injustice, but it would be followed by a march to confront injustice. As Eleanor Roosevelt once said, the world needs dreamers and the world needs doers, but most of all, the world needs dreamers who do. That was the gift of Dr. King. Yes, he had a dream, but he knew it was not enough just to dream. In order to make it real, he had to act, he had to march, he had to organize, he had to get in the way of injustice. And on this day, we have an obligation to see how America measures up to Dr. King's dream. We have to hold up a mirror to America and take an accounting. The genius of Dr. King was that he did not ask anything of America that America did not claim for itself. He did not demand perfection. The standard he set for America was the standard America had set for itself. Dr. King simply insisted that America live up to the true meaning of its creed. We are all created equal, and we are endowed by our Creator with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, there is no doubt that the civil rights struggle has transformed America into a better, a stronger, and more perfect union. We passed the historic Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. We have seen African Americans climb to the highest levels of their profession and enrich our nation in every field of endeavor. We have elected the first African American president, Barack Obama, and re-elected him by a large margin. But while we have made good progress, it is not good enough. And I know we all believe that Dr. King would not be satisfied with the status quo. So let's do what Dr. King did. Let's look at what America says about itself and see how we measure up in the year 2014. Let's look at 4 areas. Equal opportunity to achieve the American dream. Equal opportunity to get a quality education. Equal justice under law. And equal access to the voting booth. Let's start with economic empowerment. We don't guarantee success in America. No one says that. We don't guarantee outcomes, but we do. We do hold ourselves up to be the great land of opportunity for all. The American story, we are told, is one where each generation, if they work hard and play by the rules, can climb farther and farther up that ladder of opportunity to the American dream. Unfortunately, there is a growing divergence between that storyline and the reality of America today. President Obama has called this the defining challenge of our time, making sure that the economy works for every working American. Last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the historic March on Washington. That was not only a march for freedom. It was also a march for jobs, the dignity of a job. Indeed, the call went out for a march for jobs and freedom. Now today, we are still emerging from the Great Recession, the greatest economic collapse since the Great Depression. The good news is that more than 8 million jobs have been created over the last 42 months, largely due to the Recovery Act. The bad news is that economic growth remains sluggish and unemployment stubbornly high. There are 3 Americans looking for every job today, and the millions of Americans have given up and stopped looking. The African American unemployment rate is 11.9%, 5.5 percentage points higher than the national rate. So job number 1 has to be to accelerate economic and job growth. But that by itself will not reignite the American dream. In fact, looking over the last 30-year span, you find a very disturbing pattern. Since 1980, our productivity as a country has been up by more than 90%. And the overall economy has doubled in size. But the income of a typical family has grown by less than 8% over that period. What has happened is that the overwhelming majority of benefits from increased productivity and a growing economy has gone to fewer and fewer Americans. The wealth and income gaps are staggering today. Today, the wealthiest 400 individuals own more wealth than the bottom half of America, more than 150 million people. Take tables 1 through 40, that's 400 people. That number of people in America owns more wealth than the bottom half, 150 million. The top 1% own 40% of the wealth in the country, while the bottom 60% own 2%. A study showed that in 2010, 93% of all income generated the previous year, 2009, that new income, the 93% of it went to the top 1%, while the bottom 97% split the remaining 7% income. So let's think about it this way. If Bill Gates walked into the room today, the economic pie of this room would grow dramatically. On average, each of us would be a multimillionaire. But of course, we would still be leaving the room with the same actual income that we walked into the room with this morning, unfortunately, Mike. So the American dream requires not just a growing pie, but an economy where everyone has a chance of a growing share of that pie. And the tragedy is that alongside this growing inequality, we have seen a dramatic slowdown in upward mobility in America. Today, in America, a child born into a household in the top 20% has about a 2 in 3 chance of staying there. But a child born into the bottom 20% has less than a 1 in 20 chance of making it to the top. That is unacceptable. Now, I want to make it clear, I do not begrudge anyone the fruits of their talent, their labor, or their risk-taking. But in too many cases, the rules in our economy are rigged. When the CEOs of the big banks got huge bonuses, even though as they were hemorrhaging money and getting taxpayer bailouts, you know something is wrong. 30 years ago, the average CEO made 25 times the income of an average worker. Today, 272 times more. So what do? Number one, we do need to accelerate jobs and economic growth. We have to expand the pie, and we should immediately boost our national investment in rebuilding, modernizing, and expanding our national infrastructure. Our roads, our bridges, our transitways, our seaports, our airports. We need to build out our broadband and high-speed internet to bridge the digital divide. These investments will strengthen the backbone of our economy and cut the high rate of unemployment. And these are good middle-class jobs that can support a family. President Obama has called for a major infrastructure investment, including a new national infrastructure bank, to leverage private sector funds. We have legislation to do this in Congress. This kind of effort used to be a bipartisan endeavor. Unfortunately, the president's plan has been blocked at every turn by a Tea Party that believes the federal government has no business in our national infrastructure. Second, we must be sure that people who work hard can lift themselves above the poverty line. It is disgraceful that someone can work full-time, 40 hours a week, and be stuck below the national poverty rate. The minimum wage in real terms is less than it was when Harry Truman was president. We can make sure that these workers get a larger slice of the pie by raising the national minimum wage to at least $10.10. That will allow more than 5 million Americans to climb out of poverty, and it will lift the wages directly or indirectly of over 70 million Americans. We have legislation in Congress to do this, and I urge the Maryland General Assembly to enact it at the state level. And I salute Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and the District of Columbia for the actions they have taken in this area. Third, we've got to extend emergency unemployment benefits for the more than 1.3 million unemployed who are still unable to find work in this economy. It is absolutely insulting to tell these Americans that you're doing them a favor and helping them find a job by cutting off all support. Helping these struggling families pay rent and put food on the table is not only good for the families, it's good for the local merchants and salesmen. They're not paying the rent and buying goods. It hurts the entire economy. In fact, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office tells us that if we don't extend emergency unemployment through the year, we'll have 200,000 fewer jobs at the end of this year than we had at the start of this year. Now, that doesn't make sense. That's a self-inflicted wound we cannot afford. It's absolutely shameful that Congress left town before Christmas, leaving over 1.3 million Americans out in the cold. I have a bill to fix this. Sandy Levin and I, we tried to get a vote on it before Christmas. We were denied the opportunity of even a vote. Fourth, we got to enact comprehensive immigration reform. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office tells us that when we let people come out of the shadows and work, it will boost economic growth and wages. And finally, in terms of economic empowerment, we have to strengthen the social safety net. Earlier this month, we marked the 50th anniversary of President Johnson's declaration of war on poverty. Now, there is no doubt that we are falling far short of our vision of an America without poverty. Over 40 million Americans remain below the federal poverty line. That is unacceptable. But what is also unacceptable is the attack from the far right on essential safety net programs. Here's what they argue. They argue that because we have not eliminated poverty, these government programs have failed and therefore have to be radically changed or abolished. But that false reasoning ignores the fact that without essential safety net programs established in Roosevelt's New Deal and in LBJ's war on poverty, millions more Americans would be in poverty today. In fact, the President's Council of Economic Advisors just released a study showing that the poverty rate has been cut by 40% today compared to 1967. It showed that without these programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Earned Income Tax Credit, food stamps, without them, an additional 45 million Americans would be in poverty today. So no, we cannot be satisfied with where we are today. But do not be fooled by those who are conducting a war on poverty. It's nothing more than a war on the poor. These are the same folks who refuse to limit excessive subsidies to big agriculture interests while they want to cut $40 billion from the food and nutrition programs for kids. These are the folks who forget the admonition, there but for the grace of God go I. And I know Dr. King, who organized the Poor People's Campaign, must be screaming from up there somewhere, saying, don't let them do it. There's one newer social insurance program I want to discuss. 4 years ago, the nation filled an important gap in the social safety net. Just as Social Security, Medicare, and other programs have strengthened economic security in decades past, so will the Affordable Care Act provide greater security in decades to come. As a result of the Affordable Care Act, millions of Americans will no longer be denied health insurance because of pre-existing conditions like asthma or diabetes or anything else. As of today, there are 6 million Americans who have affordable health care that would not have had it but for the Affordable Care Act. Now, there is no doubt that the botched rollout of the internet-based exchanges has been a setback. But we will overcome that. The real scandal is there are governors in more than 20 states today who have refused the ACA's Medicaid expansion in their states. And as a result, today, 5 million Americans are being denied affordable health care coverage. A January 15th headline in the Salt Lake Tribune tells the sad story, quote, "Teen battling cancer awaits Utah Medicaid expansion." You won't hear about that from Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh. And I am still stunned that the majority in the House shut down the federal government for 16 days just to try to stop Obamacare. Thank you, Mr. President, for not giving in. This is especially ironic because, as you well know, Obamacare for the country was based on Romneycare in Massachusetts. So you know in a few years when Obamacare becomes very popular, our Tea Party friends are going to start calling it Romneycare. Now look, these debates over the economy, over jobs, over income inequality and the social safety net play out in Congress during the battle over the budget. I'm privileged to be the senior Democrat on the House Budget Committee, and I get along well personally with my Republican counterpart, the chairman of the committee, Paul Ryan. But I could not disagree with him more strongly on matters of policy. His budget proposal would provide the wealthiest Americans, we talked about that income gap earlier, would provide the wealthiest Americans with a whopping 1/3 tax cut, $4 trillion tax cut, while slashing investments in education and the safety net for millions of Americans. Now, those budgets may be filled with dry numbers on lots of pages, but they tell America what we care about. They are moral documents. And on this matter, I am confident that the Reverend King would team up with Pope Francis, who recently said that the trickle-down theories of economics, and I quote, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power, unquote. Amen to that. Now, one of the biggest differences in our budgets relates to education, our investment in education. We all know that a good and equal education is essential to meeting America's promise. That is why, in your earliest days, the Alphas founded the Education Foundation, and why your first program, launched in 1919, was go to high school, go to college. And to make good on the promise of educational opportunity, we must provide quality early education, a top-notch K-12 system, and an affordable college education for all who seek it. We have made substantial progress in these areas over the last decades. But despite the gains, persistent and unacceptable gaps remain. Nationally, at the K-12 level, the data shows that the achievement gap between whites and blacks has narrowed over the last 30 years, but still remains. The same is true for both high school and college dropout rates. And last year's report by the County Council's Office of Legislative Oversight demonstrated that even in Montgomery County, with our strong and highly regarded school system, we have a persistent achievement gap in certain key areas. We must do better here and throughout the country. We must ensure high expectations for every student and encourage every student to meet his or her full potential. And I applaud your president of the Scholarship Endowment Fund, Steve Galloway, and the entire chapter for your leadership in this area. What would Dr. King say about the state of education in America? We know he would not be happy with the status quo. We all need to do better. One area where we can make a substantial long-term difference is in the area of early education. Properly designed Head Start programs have been shown to have long-term benefits in achievement, earnings, and employment. Yet at current funding levels, only 11% of children eligible for Head Start and Early Head Start get slots. The President has an early education plan aimed at transforming early education, and I am co-sponsoring legislation to implement it. There is another area that needs school reform. We need to change some of the excessively harsh and rigid zero-tolerance school discipline policies that are also unevenly applied. We all want our schools to be safe places of learning. Of course we do. That's a given. But the national data shows that Black and Hispanic students are disproportionately and unjustifiably subjected to suspension, expulsion, and even arrest for nonviolent offenses compared to their white counterparts. As Attorney General Eric Holder recently said, a routine school disciplinary infraction should land the student in the principal's office, not in a police precinct. So I welcome the recent guidance unveiled earlier this month by Attorney General Holder and the Secretary of Education at Frederick Douglass High School in Baltimore. The discriminatory impact of these practices in schools is part of a larger issue that also impacts our criminal justice system. So I next ask, is America meeting its promise of equal justice under law? The United States has by far the largest incarceration rate in the world. We have 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners. We all want a system that protects the public safety and keeps violent criminals out of our neighborhoods. But the number of nonviolent individuals locked up in American prisons is a national tragedy. Almost half the inmates in state prisons are there for nonviolent crimes, 17% of them for drug-related offenses. In the federal system, 50% of inmates are there for drug-related offenses. These huge rates of incarceration for nonviolent and drug-related offenses are bad enough on their own. The situation is made much worse by the racially discriminatory nature of some of those laws and the discriminatory application of many others. The Sentencing Project reports that African American defendants are 21% more likely to receive mandatory minimum sentences than white defendants, and are 20% more likely to be sentenced to prison. In my view, there should be no place for minimum mandatory sentences for nonviolent crimes, period. They make us less safe by overcrowding our prisons with nonviolent offenders, creating perverse incentives to be lenient on more violent offenders. So I was pleased when Attorney General Holder announced last August that the Justice Department was finally rethinking the notion of minimum mandatory sentences for drug-related crimes. Let's face it, we all know the war on drugs has been a failure. We would be far better off moving to a model where people with substance abuse problems receive appropriate treatment rather than keeping them locked away without addressing the underlying problems. So what would Dr. King say? I think he would be astounded that we're locking up so many people for nonviolent crimes when at the national level we cannot even enact common sense steps to keep guns out of the hands of convicted felons. The death toll, whether it's on the streets of Washington, D.C. or Sandy Hook Elementary School, is simply unacceptable. And I think Dr. King would be appalled today that 1.4 million black men, 13% of the African American males, are denied the ability to vote because they've served some time. That is a gross injustice in so many ways. And that brings me to my last benchmark. Are we keeping our promise of equal access to the voting booth? We all recognize that making progress on fundamental issues we've discussed today, economic empowerment, educational opportunity, equal justice, that they all depend fundamentally on political empowerment. That's why during the 1930s, the Alphas launched the Voter Education and Registration Initiative under the banner of voteless people is a hopeless people. On 3 occasions, I have had the privilege of joining my friend and congressional colleague, John Lewis, to reenact the 1965 Voting Rights March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. I saw John Lewis on one of the screens earlier. As you know, John Lewis and his fellow marchers were met with billy clubs and police brutality in what became known as Bloody Sunday. That incident shocked the nation. It was a wake-up call, and within 5 months, the Congress enacted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I was proud to serve on the House Judiciary Committee in 2006, the last time Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act. We held 12 hearings, 46 witnesses, 12,000 pages, Ike, of reports demonstrating the continuing need for all parts of the Voting Rights Act. The vote in the House in 2006 was an overwhelming 390 to 33. In the Senate, 98 to nothing. When's the last time you've seen a vote like that? Expressing the sentiment and views and facts in the record. It was signed into law by President Bush, the reauthorization. So many of us were stunned last year when, in an act of supreme judicial arrogance, the court ripped a big hole in the Voting Rights Act on a 5-4 vote in the Shelby County case. The court struck down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which contains the formula for determining which states with a history of voting discrimination had to receive pre-clearance from the United States Justice Department before changing their voting laws. The result was predictable. Texas immediately enacted a stringent voter ID law that had been rejected by a federal court in Texas the previous year. 2 months later, North Carolina enacted strict new photo ID requirements, eliminated same-day registration, and shortened the early voting period. Other states followed suit. Some of these voter ID laws might be justified if there was any evidence of significant fraud, even insignificant fraud. This is an answer in search of a virtually non-existent problem. And that's why the purpose is crystal clear. It's a thinly veiled, and I say thinly veiled, effort to impede voting by lower-income individuals and seniors who are least likely to possess current driver licenses and photo IDs. And it is clearly aimed at suppressing minority voters' participation. Too much blood has been spilled and too many tears shed to win universal access to the voting booth to allow people to turn back the clock now. It is a sad day in our democracy when some seek to win election not by getting the most Americans to vote for them, but by limiting access to the voting booth. That they seek to win not by adding votes, but by subtracting them. We've got to fight these efforts. 3 steps. 1, we have to pass a new Voting Rights Act at the national level that addresses the issue the Supreme Court raised in the Shelby case. Just last week, just Thursday, a bipartisan bill was introduced by Democrat John Conyers, a great leader in the civil rights movement, and Republican Jim Sensenbrenner. It's not as strong as I would like, but it will go some distance to repairing the damage. Second, the Justice Department must use its remaining powers under the portions of the Voting Rights Act that were not struck down to vigorously challenge efforts to impede access to the ballot box. Attorney General Holder has filed suits against both Texas and North Carolina, and I strongly support those efforts. And there was a good outcome in the case in Pennsylvania the other day, striking down their restrictive law. Third, while we fight the efforts to restrict access to the ballot box, we've got to press forward at the local level, the state level, and the national level to expand access to voting, pressing ahead with laws to allow early voting, voting by mail, and mandating that enough voting machines be in place so people don't have to wait in line 5, 6, 7, 8 hours before casting a ballot. In Congress, I am a co-sponsor of legislation to do exactly that. And finally, it is a continuing national disgrace that the people who live in our nation's capital of our great democracy do not have a member of Congress who has voting rights. We got to change all that. Beyond overcoming those efforts to limit access to the voting booth, I fear an equally dangerous threat to our democracy, and that is the huge increase in the amount of money, especially secret money, that is now pouring into elections around the country. This rush of money is largely the result of another outrageous Supreme Court decision by the nice-sounding name Citizens United. It's not nice. That decision gave giant corporations the same rights as individuals, the same rights as you and me and everybody in our room, our friends and neighbors, to spend money on political advertising. It has resulted in a flood of money to try to buy elections. In the 2012 elections, more than $400 million in secret money, people who wouldn't disclose who the donors were, was spent in advertising attacking the president and congressional candidates. This volume of outside money, especially the secret money, is a direct challenge to the health of our democracy. In 2010, I introduced what is called the Disclose Act, which would provide transparency and accountability for this spending. We passed it out of the House, but in a terrible irony of history, because Senator Kennedy passed away, we failed by one vote to block a Republican filibuster in the Senate. Since then, we have not even been able to have a vote on this bill, not since the November 2010 Tea Party takeover. The goal of these groups is clear. They want to buy a Congress that will roll back the important strides we've made and block further progress. So a hard look at those 4 areas we discussed this morning: economic empowerment, educational opportunity, equal justice, and equal access to the voting booth, shows we still have a long way to go to meet the promise of America. In each of these areas, I've also cited proposed legislation in Congress that John Sarbanes and I and others support to address these matters. Legislation to boost job growth and infrastructure, increase the minimum wage, end discriminatory minimum mandatory laws, transform our national approach to early education, restore essential parts of the Voting Rights Act, comprehensive immigration legislation, legislation to require disclosure of all this money that's pouring in. Unfortunately, under the Tea Party-controlled House of Representatives, we have not even been allowed a vote on one of those measures. It's not that they've lost. We haven't even been allowed to vote on those measures. Democracy has not been allowed to work its will. On many of those measures that we had a vote, they would pass. But they're locked down, won't let a vote. Democracy has been suspended in the House of Representatives when it comes to these essential areas. We cannot allow that to happen. So in closing, I would just ask not what Dr. King would say, what would Dr. King do? And we need to follow the genius, that gift that he had. We need to point out the problems, but then we need to galvanize. We need to organize. We need to register. We need to get out the vote from people who want to change. When someone tries to block us at the voting booth, yes, we try and tear down that law, but we try and get 100 more people registered and voting. That's how we got to go after it from all angles. We need to follow the examples of the great leaders, Dr. King, Nelson Mandela. What a leader, Nelson Mandela, we miss him. And of Mahatma Gandhi. We need to get in the way of injustice. Complacency is the enemy of progress. We know that. Dr. King always said that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. But he also understood that we had to help give it a big tug. The Alphas did not give up. The Alphas did not give up on getting a Dr. King holiday. And here we are today. We have a King holiday. The Alphas did not get up on erecting a memorial to Dr. King in its rightful place next to the Jefferson Memorial and the Lincoln Memorials. And today, that memorial to Dr. King rises proudly there, out of a mountain of despair, a stone of hope. So we must together, as brothers and sisters, take on these new challenges with what Dr. King told us to do, the fierce urgency of now. It is our duty, it is our calling, and together, as brothers and sisters, we will overcome and build an ever more perfect union. Thank you, the Alphas. God bless everybody here this morning.
Congressman Van Hollen, the brothers of IUL, thank you for accepting our invitation to speak on this special occasion. The words you have spoken today reminded us that we are dreamers, and there are dreamers that do. Ladies and gentlemen, which one are you? Also, you reminded us that we are still fighting equal opportunities in the area of economic empowerment, education, equal justice, and equal access to voting booths. Improvements have been made in these areas. However, there is still room to do better. We can continue to unite on one accord and hold the elected officials accountable. We cannot be satisfied with the status quo. Are you a dreamer or a dreamer that do? Remember, complacency is the enemy of progress. Thank you again, Congressman Van Hollen, for those words. Thank you.